I didn't come back to Virginia City because something was wrong. I came back because everything felt peaceful. It was the second week of December. Snow rested lightly on the Nevada hills, and Christmas lights stretched across C Street the same way they always had. Steady, modest, unafraid of the dark. The kind of town people trust without thinking. The kind of place where the church bell rings on time, the doors stay unlocked, and no one worries about what's been left unsaid. I parked near the old opera house and stepped into the cold. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke. Somewhere down the street the bell rang. Slow, deliberate. Not a warning, not an alarm. Just a reminder that evening had arrived. And for the first time in years, I felt calm. That's important to say now, because later it will sound like a lie. But it wasn't. Virginia City felt peaceful, and I've since learned that peace is often what a town feels like when it's learned how not to remember. I stayed in Virginia City that night longer than I meant to. Not because I had plans, but because the town has a way of slowing you down, making you feel like leaving too quickly would be impolite. I checked into the old boarding house on B Street, the one that's been run by the same family for as long as anyone remembers. They'd replaced the plumbing and the mattresses, but not the photographs. Black and white faces stared down from the walls, men with heavy coats and tired eyes, women who never smiled for the camera. Mrs. Williams met me at the desk. "You came back for Christmas," she said. Not as a question. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded, satisfied, and slid the key across the counter. Real metal, heavy, room 6. The same room my father stayed in the last winter he spent here. I didn't mention that. Neither did she. That's how Virginia City works. You don't announce old knowledge. You let it sit between you, acknowledged but untouched. My room faced the hill. From the window, I could see the church standing above the town, its windows glowing softly against the dusk. I remember thinking how safe it all looked, how complete, and how strange it was that a place so careful about preserving its past never spoke about certain years at all. That night, as I lay awake listening to the building settle, I heard the bell again. Slow, deliberate, not calling anyone, just reminding the town that time was still moving, whether it wanted to or not. The next morning, Virginia City woke slowly. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air carried that quiet heaviness that usually comes before it does. Store owners swept their sidewalks. Wreaths were adjusted. Bells on doors chimed softly as people went in and out, unhurried. I walked the length of C Street with no destination in mind. That's another thing the town encourages. You don't move with purpose here unless you have to. It was only after I passed the same faces a second time that I noticed something. No one asked me why I'd come back. Not once. People greeted me warmly, nodded as I passed, spoke about weather and Christmas plans. But no one asked what had brought me home. It was as if the answer was already understood, or as if the question itself had been quietly agreed upon as unnecessary. That afternoon, I climbed the hill to St. Joseph's. The doors were open, and the smell of old wood and candle wax drifted out to meet me. Inside, the church was empty, except for a few women arranging poinsettias along the altar. The silence felt respectful, practiced. I sat in the back pew and listened to nothing for a while. When Reverend Callahan noticed me, he didn't seem surprised. "You've been gone a long time," he said. "Yes, sir." "But you came back." I nodded. He looked at me carefully then, not unkindly, but as though measuring something. "Some places," he said, "don't mind being remembered." He paused. "Others prefer to be protected." I asked him what he meant. He smiled gently and said, "You'll hear the bell tonight." That evening, I did. Exactly at 7:17. One slow toll. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. The bell wasn't marking time. It was marking agreement. By the fourth day, I stopped pretending the patterns were accidental. The bell rang at the same time every night. Conversations ended the same way, gently, before becoming specific. And whenever the past came up, it was spoken about the way people speak around a sickbed, quietly, respectfully, and only in general terms. That afternoon, I walked to the cemetery. It sat just beyond the edge of town, where the road thinned and the houses gave way to scrub and stone. Snow dusted the ground lightly, settling into carved letters like punctuation. My father's grave was near the back. I stood there longer than I meant to. Behind his headstone was a smaller section I didn't recognize. Not unmarked exactly, but unfinished. Older stones, simpler ones. Some with names worn down until they were no longer legible. What struck me wasn't their age. It was their absence. No wreaths, no candles, no sign that anyone had visited them at all. I asked a man tending another grave nearby who they were. He hesitated. "From the winter," he said. "Which winter?" He didn't answer. That evening, I went to the historical museum. It was nearly empty, the lights dimmed low to preserve photographs most people never stopped long enough to look at anyway. A volunteer named Thomas recognized me after a moment. "You're his son," he said. I nodded. He studied me carefully before motioning toward the back. "We don't show this part to tourists," he said. Inside the archive room, he pulled a folder from a locked cabinet and placed it on the table between us. December 1907. It was colder than expected, Thomas said. Supplies didn't arrive. People had to make choices. He slid a photograph toward me. I recognized the building immediately. St. Joseph's on the hill. In the photo, people stood outside its doors. Men, women, children, waiting. "They asked for shelter," Thomas said. I waited. "The elders voted," he continued. "On what?" He folded his hands. "On whether opening the doors would endanger everyone else." I felt something settle in my chest. Not shock, but understanding. No monsters, no violence, just a decision. When I left the museum, snow had begun to fall in earnest. The bell rang that night at 7:17, just as it always did. But for the first time, I noticed something new. The sound didn't travel across town. It stayed close to the hill, as if it were waiting to see whether the door would open again. Christmas Eve arrived without ceremony. No storm, no warning, just a heavier stillness than the days before it. Virginia City moved carefully that morning, as if the town itself were aware of the date. Storefronts opened later than usual. Conversations stayed brief. Even the children's voices seemed subdued, as though someone had reminded them, gently, not to run. I noticed that wreaths had gone up everywhere. On doors, on windows, along the railings that trace the hill. Everywhere, except the cemetery. I walked there just before noon. The snow had been disturbed now. Fresh footprints crossing the paths, stopping at familiar stones. My father's grave had been brushed clean. The others hadn't. Someone had started to place wreaths near them, then stopped. The effort lay unfinished. That afternoon, the church bell rang early. Not at 7:17, but just once, shortly after 3. No one commented on it. That worried me more than if they had. Inside St. Joseph's, volunteers moved quietly, lighting candles, straightening hymnals, laying out programs printed with careful language. Christmas Eve service. All welcome. The words looked heavier in ink than they should have. I found Reverend Callahan alone near the altar. He was seated, hands folded, not praying, just sitting with the space. "You're keeping the doors open?" I said. He nodded. "All night," he said. I asked him if he was afraid. He considered the question. "Fear," he said, "is usually a sign that we've waited too long." As evening approached, the town gathered earlier than usual. Coats were hung carefully. People chose seats with intention, some near the aisle, others closer to the back, as if proximity itself carried meaning. I sat where I could see the doors clearly. They were open, wide enough to let the cold in, wide enough to let anything else decide whether to enter. Outside, the sky darkened early, clouds pressing low against the hills. Snow began to fall again, slower than before, heavier. At 7:10, the church grew completely silent. Not because anyone asked for it, but because everyone knew what time it was. I watched the clock. 7:15, 7:16. And as the second hand moved toward its place, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think until then. If the bell rang tonight, it would mean nothing had changed. And if it didn't, it would mean we were no longer alone. The second hand reached its place. 7:17 passed. The bell did not ring. No sound followed, not even the settling of wood. The silence was so complete that I became aware of my own breathing, slow and careful, as if it might be heard by someone outside. Reverend Callahan did not speak. He did not look at the clock. He simply remained where he was, hands resting on the worn edge of the altar, waiting. The cold deepened. Snow crossed the threshold in thin, deliberate lines, melting into the dark wood of the floor. And then someone stood in the doorway. No knock, no announcement. Just a figure where light met night. It was a woman. Her coat was thin, cut in a style no one wore anymore. Snow clung to the seams and hems, not falling away as it should have. She did not step inside at first. She waited. The choir did not stop breathing, but it did stop humming. A child shifted in a pew and was gently stilled by a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. Reverend Callahan stepped down from the altar. He did not raise his voice. "You are welcome," he said. The woman looked at him carefully, as if weighing the words. "We always were," she replied. She crossed the threshold. The cold did not follow her. Others appeared behind her. Men, women, children bundled in clothing worn thin by time rather than weather. They did not drift. They walked. They filled the open spaces between pews, sitting where room was made for them without being asked. No one screamed. No one ran. Names moved through the room like prayer, spoken quietly, sometimes only with lips. The figures stayed only as long as necessary. They did not accuse. They did not ask forgiveness. They bore witness simply by being seen. When they stood again, they left the same way they had entered. Slowly, without ceremony. Outside, their footprints marked the snow briefly, before disappearing beneath fresh white. The doors remained open, long after the last of them had gone. No one rushed to speak after the doors finally closed. The service did not end the way it had been planned. There was no benediction, no dismissal, no announcement that it was time to go home. People remained where they were, sitting beside the space that had just been occupied, as though leaving too quickly might undo what had been acknowledged. Reverend Callahan returned to the altar slowly. "What we witnessed tonight," he said, "was not judgment." He paused. It was memory. The candles burned lower. Wax pooled at their bases, uncollected, No one moved to tidy them. When people did begin to leave, it was quietly. Coats were lifted without shaking off snow. Doors were held longer than necessary. Strangers looked at one another with the kind of recognition that doesn't require conversation. Outside, the night had softened. The wind had died down. Snow continued to fall, not covering anything, just resting. At midnight, the bell rang. Not the single toll we had grown used to, but a full peal, clear and steady, rolling out across the hills. People stopped where they stood to listen. Some bowed their heads, others closed their eyes. No one looked afraid. I walked back to the boarding house alone. The lights in the windows along the street stayed on longer than usual, as if the town had decided collectively not to sleep yet. In room 6, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the building settle. For the first time, it felt like rest, not vigilance. The next morning, Virginia City looked the same. Wooden buildings, snow-lined streets, history preserved carefully. But something fundamental had shifted. In the cemetery, wreaths had been placed, even on the nameless stones. I left town before noon. As I drove away, the church stood quiet on the hill. Doors closed now, not in refusal, but in peace. I've thought often about what faith means since that night. I no longer believe it protects us from consequence. I believe it asks us to face it. Virginia City didn't lose its faith that winter long ago. It delayed it. And Christmas, patient as it is, waited. If this story stayed with you, it isn't because of what appeared in the doorway. It's because of what waited there for so long. Stories like this don't ask us to be afraid. They ask us to remember, to listen more carefully, to notice what's been left outside. I tell these stories for anyone who believes faith means more than comfort. And that responsibility doesn't end just because time has passed. If you'd like to hear more quiet American stories like this one, you're welcome to stay.